since one of the most traumatic and life-changing events in United States history. You know that which I'm talking about? We call it 9/11. Here to talk with me about that event is one who lived through those events personally, Dr. Darold Bigger. Dr. Bigger, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your role in the Naval Chaplaincy. You were Rear Admiral Darold Bigger with the reserves. Tell us a little bit about that before we get into the specific events surrounding 9/11.
Okay. With you and all the people I know, Darold works just fine, Dan. So
okay.
Let's just make it personal and conversational. I was in the Navy Reserve for almost 30 years. And at the time of 9/11, I had been promoted to a one-star admiral, a rear admiral, and was overseeing the religious ministry and programs in the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard Reserve. So in that role, I had an office in New Orleans, which is where the Reserve headquarters was at the time, and also had an office in Washington, D.C., in what was then the Navy Annex, where all the Pentagon Navy officials worked, and my office was one of 3 admirals in the Chaplain Corps, the Chief of Chaplains, and a full-time Deputy Chief of Chaplains, and I was the Reserve.
Now, tell us about your work there. You said you oversaw this religious work there, but a little more specifically, what did you do? What do naval chaplains, or Coast Guard chaplains for that matter, Marine chaplains, what do they do?
Well, by the time I was in that assignment, I was visiting people who were actually doing the work.
And what is their work?
So I was at a conceptual level and supervisory level. But what do chaplains do? They are embedded in the organizations with which they function, so that a Navy chaplain is assigned to a ship or an air squadron or a unit, a support unit in the Navy, or a base, a Navy base, and they function as full-time on-site pastors. They all are qualified by their denomination or religious organization to represent them in the military. So in the Adventist Church, for example, we have an organization called Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries that validates the ministerial training and experience that an individual has before they're allowed to represent Adventists in the military, and that's true for all other religions, Christian and others.
So you just don't walk up to the gate at the base and say, hey, I'm going to be a chaplain.
Yeah, no, there's a pretty careful screening process that's two-pronged. On the side of the religious organization first, and then on the side of the military. So after you satisfy those religious requirements, you need to be fully qualified to function as a uniformed member of the U.S. military. So you go through a kind of officer training corps and orient yourself to apply your professional training in a military setting.
Now, tell us a little bit about the history of chaplaincy. In other military organizations, I'm thinking about in other countries, they don't necessarily have people they call chaplains. I mean, I can understand in communist countries, they don't believe in God, why would you have a chaplain? But what is the history within the United States military about chaplains?
Started very, very early. Early in close to colonial days, where pastors were recognized as a valuable asset to organizations where there was a significant amount of trauma and risk that people were taking, some challenges and losses, and early pastors ministered to those. And that kind of healing spiritual ministry is what embedded chaplaincy in military organizations. In the United States, we are part of the military structure, so that our promotion system works very similar to other officers in the military.
Now, your pay comes from the military and not from your religious organization. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that the Constitution of the United States guarantees every citizen of this country with the right to the freedom to express their religious convictions. The problem with military people is that they're often separated from the support system in the community, sent on a ship or deployed somewhere in another part of the world, so they're isolated from those churches, mosques, synagogues, etc. back home. And in order to provide their constitutional right to express their religious convictions, we provide chaplains to do that. Now, and that's why the military pays them.
In the context of your work, you happened to be in Washington, D.C. on the fateful day, I understand.
Yes, I was. I had been, well, the last 6 years I was a reservist. I was gone from home about half the time, so it was pretty busy and intense period. And during that summer, I had been in Washington and traveling around other parts of the country and a bit around the world, overseeing the religious programs as they were functioning. On September 12, I had airplane tickets to come back to Walla Walla, ready to teach fall quarter. I was a member of the faculty here on campus at that time.
But that didn't go quite the way you expected.
No, it sure didn't. That morning on September 11, I was working in my office, getting paperwork finished up, ready to leave for a period of time, and I had an appointment later that day in the Pentagon office with the director of the Navy Reserve to kind of give him an update on what I had been working on during the summer. Soon after 9 o'clock, we heard a ruckus down in the Chief of Chaplain's office. The chief at that time, Barry Black, was gone, but someone had gotten a call and turned the TV set on and called those of us in the chaplain staff down there just after the first tower in New York City had been hit. And we were watching live on CNN when the airplane hit the second tower. And immediately we all knew this was not a horrible pilot error. So after spending a bit of time and praying together, I went back to work to finish up what I was doing, and not long after that heard a loud, sounded like an airplane, fly over our building, and then a loud thud afterward. I asked the chaplain's assistant who was working with me if they often had airplanes fly that close over these buildings. I hadn't heard that before. And he said, oh, I think it was probably a dumpster out in the parking lot, and he probably just dropped the big container. Shortly after that, the fire alarms went off, and it was immediately clear as soon as we evacuated the building.
So some of your work actually took you into the Pentagon, and were the timing different, you could have been in that fateful section where the plane hit.
Several hours later that day, I could have been right next door to where the chasm opened in the Pentagon. The people in that office, the director of the Navy Reserve's office, survived, but they were knocked out of their chairs and had to crawl out through the fire, and it was a pretty harrowing experience for them.
What happened when you heard the thud?
Yeah.
When word was getting back, we've been attacked?
Yeah. We evacuated our building, and made sure everybody was identified in the parking lot. And then word came that they needed help down at the Pentagon. So hundreds of us flocked down there across the freeway and gathered around the outside of the Pentagon, just in front of where the crash had taken place.
Now, you've just seen 2 planes flying into the Twin Towers in New York City. Were you afraid that there might be another plane headed your direction?
In fact, while we were there, my first work was with burn victims who were being evacuated from the building. The primary problem at the Pentagon was not just the impact, but the fire, and it spread through a large section of the Pentagon itself. So there were a lot of people who were severely hurt from the fire. So I was visiting with them like a pastor would during a disaster, praying with them, trying to comfort them while they were waiting for helicopters to evacuate them to the hospitals. And while we were doing that, word came that there was another airplane flying, and they urged all of us to move our temporary gathering sites under overpasses to provide some protection in case there was another plane coming. That plane ended up to be the one that crashed in Pennsylvania, in Shanksville. So those.
So you were targeted twice, and the other plane never made it, but you were dealing with the trauma of this crash that happens right there.
And the reason that second plane didn't get there was those very brave passengers who sacrificed themselves to take that plane down. Yeah, it was once we understood all of that, it was a much more emotional moment. At the time, in the heat of dealing with those casualties, I think we were all just functioning on adrenaline. I spent over 24 hours full time down there, and then went up to my office and took a short nap on the floor and went back again. And many others did the same.
Darold, we're going to need to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to talk about the impact that this had on families of the victims and what chaplains do in that broader spectrum, not just to the victims, but to those who love them. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Valley Viewpoint. If you are just joining us, my guest today is Dr. Darold Bigger. We've been talking about his work during the attacks that happened on 9/11 at the Pentagon. So, Darold, there are the people that you're ministering to right there, but they're related to other people. You also have these first responders that are coming in. Have you talked with I'm sure you've talked with your wife since then, and I'm just wondering, she's probably watching this on television knowing that you're somewhere in that area and wondering if you're alive or safe, or what was her reaction?
She should be very upset at me because I had not thought a twit about her or anybody back home. Totally absorbed in what was happening right then. And finally, one of our chaplain assistants came to me with what was then a fairly early cell phone. I didn't have one myself. Handed me this cell phone and said, "Sir, you need to call your wife." So you're right, exactly. She knew I had this appointment in the Pentagon that afternoon, and had been quite concerned. I reached her and shared with her that I was fine. And
how long did she have to wait?
I don't remember how many hours it was, but it was
so it was
hours.
Several hours. She's
sure.
wondering back here in Washington, what's happening in Washington D.C. to you, and there's no word.
You bet.
And that story can be multiplied many times for all the other people that are involved in this response and in this incident.
And even very recently, those kinds of experiences we have families go through. I have a cousin whose whose niece actually has a Marine husband who was sent to Kabul during the evacuation from Afghanistan. And when she heard about the deaths of the Marines there, she called me and said, "How will I find out if he was among them?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is that worry. Families invest themselves in these activities. It's not just the person in uniform. Yeah.
So
and in the case of that morning, well, you want to ask?
no,
something?
no,
Okay.
you're going right where I want to go.
Okay. In the case of that morning, not only were we working with a lot of first responders who were there, some of whom were finding very gruesome sights. Firefighters first doused the flames enough that emergency personnel could go into the building. And some of what they were finding was horrific. I went to New York City 10 days later to visit with the chaplains and emergency personnel there. A similar kind of experience. The trauma that those who were working in the recovery was very intense. So at the Pentagon, we had a tent set up that was identified as a chaplain's location, so that people who needed a little resource or a little encouragement or a chance just to break away from the intensity of what they were doing had a bit of refuge there. And in the Navy, it's the case that all death notices are made to families in person. And part of the challenge in that case was that it took a while to identify who all had been injured, whether they were injured and evacuated to a medical facility or whether they had been killed. And I was assigned, along with a couple of other Navy people, to the family of a single mother who had left her 2-year-old girl with the girl's grandparents that morning in Virginia and driven in to the Navy, into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. And she wasn't heard from that day. She wasn't heard from the next day, and it took several days. Finally, they discovered her car in an impound lot. No sign that she had used it after the attack. And several days later, we got notice from the military morgue in Delaware that her remains had been identified with DNA testing. So we contacted the family and told them we would like to come. Her father was a retired Navy chief and knew what that would mean.
Right.
And said, "We don't want you to come here. Don't come here."
What do you do in a situation like that?
We went.
Yeah.
Because that's what the protocol was. We drove into their driveway, and three of us were in a van. I got out, and a woman came from around the back of the house, walked up to me and saw the cross on my uniform indicating that I was a Christian chaplain, shook her finger in my face and said, "I blame God for this, and I don't want to talk to you," and turned around and walked away. We went up to the door and rang the doorbell, waited, rang the bell again several times. Finally, a young man, probably in his 20s, came and answered the door, took us into the living room, and there the three of us sat by ourselves. And slowly, over the next period of time, family members came in to join us one by one. Someone then said that the girl's mother was in another room and maybe I would want to go speak with her. And I did that. And she joined us then. The officer who was with us then told the family that had gathered by then that he had brought home pilots in his training units before, brought them home in body bags. And he knew a little bit about what this was, what this meant to them. The active duty chief who was with us said that his mother-in-law had died earlier that year of cancer. So he knew what it was like to lose someone. And I told them about our daughter who had been murdered a few years before. And remembered what it was like to lose a child.
So we have a
It was an example of what Jesus did for us, an incarnation. You know, when we're with people who understand what we're going through, we're able to face our own problems with the support of those other people. And by the time we left that day, we were all standing in their living room with our arms around one another, and we prayed together. So,
including the lady that shook the finger,
yep,
her finger in your face.
Yep, she was there as well. That's what chaplains do. We celebrate with people. We suffer with people. We are there when they need someone to connect them with the God outside themselves.
I suppose it's more often the latter than the former. That is, you are people when they're suffering rather than when they're celebrating. If they probably don't need you when they're celebrating.
Well, we as Christians all know that we're more open to acknowledging who God is when we feel a sense of loss and need for help.
What was your trip like to New York after the Pentagon was attacked? You said 10 days later you were in New York. What was it like right after this horrific event?
Well, it was horrible. Even that long later, the pile of debris was still 10 stories high. They were working on it.
The debris was 10 stories high.
Yeah, the debris, just the heap of rubble. They were working on it with huge machinery and with individuals with hand tools. Every time they found even a fragment of a person, a big steam whistle would blow, a chaplain told me. A big steam whistle would blow, all the work would stop. A litter was brought to that site. The remains were placed on the litter. If there was a chaplain there, the chaplain prayed and accompanied them off the pile of debris to the morgue. And they had portable refrigerated vans that were serving as morgues. The devastation was much more extensive in New York than it was in Washington, D.C. And it was much more complicated to identify people because all military personnel had DNA markers taken on them by then. But in New York City, that was not the case.
So, a long, protracted time to identify, and I'm sure there were some who were never.
It is true.
Never were.
Yeah, there are some who have never been recovered. There's a poignant scene in a documentary by Martin Doblmeier. That documentary is called The Power of Forgiveness, and he interviews several women who were survivors and lost relatives in that attack. And one of them talks very intensely about what it's like to know her son is buried out in a garbage dump on Staten Island.
Yes.
Yeah, because they could just never recover them.
A horrible, horrible, horrible fate. Listen, I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your heart and through some very painful experiences. Thank you for joining us for Valley Viewpoint today. This was a signature event in our nation's history that affected so many people. Perhaps it's just a moment when we can pause and pray. Thank you.